Starting applause. Thank you. So I'm happy to be back at Union College and this symposium today. 2 years ago, I talked here about educating engineers for civic mindedness. That was the title for my talk. And today I get to report on how my research and pedagogy has evolved since then. So I'll start by saying my undergraduates at Olin College really want to make a positive impact, right? This is kind of one of their reasons for wanting to be engineers. They see engineering as that career path to being able to build a better world. Now, their initial kind of theories of change are often very naive, as you might experience with your own students who want to do this. But I want them to hold on to the hope of positive impact through their 4 years. You know, the 4 years of equations, prototypes, internships, and feel like they can live their values wherever their careers take them. Now, the fields of engineering and computing have been experiencing a rightful reckoning with the negative impacts of emerging technologies. Citizens and governments have been realizing the inadequacy of traditional models of personal, professional, and corporate ethics in these spaces. And we've had new research, curriculum, and ethics codes emerging in response to this global focus on technology ethics. And I've participated in countless conferences and meetings with scholars, educators, practitioners, all trying to figure out how higher education can cultivate the necessary critical mindsets and ethical skills of these technologists and engineers we need. And I've introduced many of those novel ideas that we've kind of come up with in that space into the design, computer science, and social science courses I teach. I'm here to say I'm reaching some of the students, but not all of them. Okay? And so I've tried to categorize some failure modes here of the student reactions that I get. One, whoa, engineers have done some really bad things. I don't want to be an engineer anymore. This happens. Maybe it's among your students as well. Another category is ethics and responsibility seem important, but it doesn't seem relevant to the kind of engineering I want to do. Another reaction I see is you can't anticipate how people will misuse technology. This is just the cost of innovation and progress. And then the fourth, which gets me excited, building technology in an ethical way sounds like exactly what I want to do. But I'm not seeing any job postings for ethical engineer. Can I even get a job doing this? So I would say most of my reactions are not in that fourth category, that kind of minor success. Most are in that spectrum of failure of 1 to 3. Now, in each of these failure modes, critical examination of how technology is created and its impacts on the world, I think, erodes their sense of responsibility. And it also erodes that hope of a positive impact that they can have and instead elicits some kinds of defensiveness, all right? Now, 4 years isn't a lot of time, and the mentorship my colleagues and I offer is only a sliver of the learning experience that students will have during their undergraduate time, right? I want to make the most of it. I want to increase the likelihood that I cultivate their fragile hope and equip them with sophisticated theories of change. So that's kind of where I'm at, right? And my motivation for studying promoting civic mindedness really started with, my own background, but also Erin Seck's research on engineering education, which many of you are familiar with. When she found that studying the students' commitments to public welfare concerns actually erode over time from their first year to their fourth year. And to put a finer point on it, Olin was one of the schools that she studied. So there's nothing about our innovative approach that's, insulates us from these trends. That was a while ago that she did that study. It's been repeated more recently. This was posted on EdSurge back in 2021. Another study looking at survey measures of global citizenship, also seeing that computing and engineering students have an erosion in their reporting on those global citizenship metrics over 4 years. So it's still with us. Now, I teach at Olin. For those of you that don't know, it's a selective engineering-only college of less than 500 students located in the Boston suburbs. I really take pride in Olin's history of innovation in undergraduate engineering education, longstanding emphasis on project-based learning, human-centered design, entrepreneurial thinking. The college was incorporated by the Franklin W. Olin Foundation in 1997 to establish a new paradigm for engineering education. But I think what's really interesting is this artifact. It was their petition letter to the Massachusetts Board of Education. The foundation directors emphasized how they see a future in which an undergraduate engineering education becomes the true liberal education. That is, an education which liberates one to lead a personal and professional life of full citizenship in one's local, national, and global communities. It's right there. Like we're not a land-grant institution, which some of you might have, which often has that built into it, but it's there in our founding documents. Now, I believe, like all of you do, that the next chapter of engineering education should really require making good on that promise of liberal education and recommitting to a holistic definition of higher education's public purpose. There is no dualistic separation of social and technical concerns, as tech and decades of science and technology studies scholarship tells us. This demands we prepare engineering and computing students in ways that integrate their personal and professional identities into what educational philosopher Carolyn Kraber calls an authentic professional identity. So let me go into a little bit of her book. So authenticity for Kraber is an integral part of the Aristotelian concept of eudaimonia, often translated as human flourishing. Living to one's fullest potential requires living in accordance with one's values, living authentically. I find Kraber's book compelling because her goal is reinvigorating professional education by emphasizing its public purpose, to cultivate civic professionals who practice their professions authentically. For Kraber, this kind of civic-mindedness or civic professionalism is an overarching professional capability. She builds her definition on theorists that come from civic engagement and political theory, Harry Boyt and Albert Zur, folks that I've referenced in my own work, where Boyd's citizen professional does not readily distinguish between a civic identity and a professional identity, that they understand their work to be about strengthening communities and aim to co-create and jointly solve problems with other citizens. Rather than playing the role of a technocratic custodian, Albert Zur, similarly in his description of a democratic professional, shares power with citizens, the many people who have a stake in professional decision-making. So we don't ignore that in the ways that we actually approach our profession. Now, this idea of civic professionalism is the external component of what Kraber argues for in her definition of a civic professional. And that must be synthesized with an internal self-cultivation of virtue. To achieve an authentic professional identity relies, in fact, on openness to experience, allowing the professionals to cope with the uncertainties and challenges of their work, a moral commitment, driving professionals to use critical reflection to work towards a more just world, and responsible community engagement, connecting professionals to their communities and motivating them to work for the common good. This actually emanates from that personal work that they're doing, right? Not just the idea of the definitions of what their practice is as a professional. Now, character and virtue education is an ancient purpose for education and core to what we mean by a liberal education. But it is rarely emphasized in secular institutions of higher education, and it is well outside the traditional approaches to professional identity and ethics in engineering. So we need some model of ethics and virtue. Carolyn Kraber leans on Aristotle and Martha Nussbaum, another philosopher, for her definitions of virtue. But for engineers, I think it's imperative to update our ideas of virtue in the way Shannon Valor does in her book, Technology and the Virtues. Valor argues that emerging technologies pose unprecedented ethical challenges, and our traditional virtue frameworks are not really up to the task of promoting human flourishing in a world interconnected by opaque socio-technical systems. So I think it's really important that we think about virtue ethics actually as deeply connected to the kind of technical work that we do. And so this helps us. And I put forward 4 of her techno-moral virtues that resonate, I think, really strongly with how I've been trying to adapt civic professionalism in my teaching. And that's humility, courage, care, and civility. So techno-moral humility involves recognizing the limits of one's own knowledge and understanding of complex technosocial systems, being mindful of the potential for unintended negative consequences, and avoiding techno-optimism or solutionism. I think some of you already do this in your work. And I don't want this to feel like it is completely foreign to what we try and do when we combine engineering and liberal education. But I want us to think about how virtue actually helps us put a finer point on that and connect it between those internal and external work that we're doing. Techno-moral care is a skillful and attentive, responsible and emotionally responsive disposition to personally meet the needs of those with whom we share our techno-social environment. Techno-moral courage is the willingness to take considered risks and to speak up against injustice and unethical practices in the development and use of technology. This can mean making difficult decisions, challenging powerful interests, or simply refusing to go along with the crowd. And techno-moral civility involves valuing and engaging in ethical communal life with one's fellow citizens. It goes beyond mere politeness and requires actively fostering understanding, cooperation, and respect across diverse perspectives and cultures. I think for engineers in society, we actually have to think about how we are helping cultivate these facets of character, these particular virtues. So how do we do that? There are many ways to teach virtue. There's a great paper in 2022 by Michael Lamb, Jonathan Brandt, and Edward Brooks that offers 7 strategies. Happy to share that later. But Kraber argues that the internal and external components of civic professionalism can be fostered through, at best, transformative educational experiences that are action-oriented, provide opportunities for students to engage with their communities, and challenge their assumptions about the role of technology in society. So experiential learning, some of that. Project-based learning, some of that. For the past 6 years, I've been trying to create such learning experiences with my own students, both inside and outside the curriculum. So let me reflect a little bit about that and how it connects to these ideas of virtue. So in 2019, several students and I co-founded a public interest technology clinic. Students called it PINT, which is adorable. While I could have made this my personal lab, I intentionally relinquished control to the students, emphasizing student leadership and ownership of that clinic. I wanted them to wrestle with key organizational decisions and work through the complexity of managing client relationships. The founding team, this group of students, most of them first years when we came up with this idea, wanted to create a space for students to develop more than technical skills and to explore social and ethical dimensions of engineering work not covered in most of their courses. They chose to foster a culture of care within PINT, prioritizing emotional well-being and open communication, which contrasted with their previous experiences in technical spaces, where emotional expression was often discouraged. They were thinking back to like the robotics clubs that they were a part of in high school and saying, I don't want that again. They created a supportive environment that encouraged vulnerability, empathy, and honest feedback. So PINT challenged some of these traditional engineering emphases on rapid work and efficiency by encouraging instead thoughtful reflection, deliberation. In their clinic work, they engaged in meaningful dialogue with their community partners, considering the needs and perspectives of all stakeholders. So one of the first clinic teams, which is shown here, worked on the issue of human trafficking, which I think acutely demonstrates how some of my students develop some of these civic-mindedness, civic professionalism qualities, and in particular, techno-moral courage. The team was asked to design a web scraper for an anti-trafficking organization. They started by looking at the technical challenges of scraping and storing images from sites known to advertise trafficked women. As I coached this team, I encouraged them to research the larger context of sex work and the use of technology to address trafficking. They learned about the potential harm to sex workers whose data would be collected and shared with law enforcement without the assurance that their safety and well-being would be maintained through that process. They also looked at the ethical implication of designing technologies that could be used for surveillance and potentially contribute to the criminalization of vulnerable populations. As a result of their research and deep conversations and reflection, the team decided in the end to refuse to design that web scraper for their partner organization. They communicated their decision to the partner in a detailed letter, discussing their research insights and the discomfort they had with the approach that the organization took around relationships with law enforcement. And then they produced an event seen here for their fellow Olin students where they talked about the choices they made and encouraging them to design no harm in the work that they do. As the students involved in the project would later confess, they thought they were failing by taking this route. While they might be reducing the chances of potential harm, they also weren't helping anybody as they thought they were going to. And being one of the early clinic partnerships when PINT was first founded, they really felt a responsibility to model what the clinic was created to do. This felt like they were not doing that. That's why I think this act of refusal exemplifies this idea of techno-moral courage. They put into practice emerging commitments to prioritizing the well-being of those potentially affected by their work, as highlighted by the way Valor talks about care, and also how Carolyn Kraber emphasizes this sense of moral commitment for professionals. This critically evaluating the ethical implications of technology beyond its intended use, they recognized the potential for unintended consequences, exercised humility and perspective, and took a stand against powerful institutions in their advocacy for justice. even when it meant defying expectations or jeopardizing partnerships. It wasn't just the students that learned from this. I took these lessons and brought it into my own advising and teaching work. So from 2019 to 2024, I ran a capstone design project that was focused on designing data tools with community partners in order to address racialized mass incarceration in the state of Massachusetts. The criminal legal system is, as you might be aware, a complex socio-technical system that is rife with ethical pitfalls. And I witnessed many of my capstone students have transformative experiences where they were in meetings with their community partners and comprehending the injustices of the current way the system worked, then wrestling with their responsibility as engineers as well as civic actors, right? Because they're engaging with these community organizations. They are involved in that political and difficult work. And then they're trying to figure out how do they propose solutions, which often to them seemed insignificant against the scale of the problems that they were talking about. So we endeavored to never reduce our project to its technical dimensions. I encouraged the students to spend time diving into those social, political, and ethical realities and to get uncomfortable. Kraber cites the transformative potential of what educational philosopher Ronald Barnett calls strangeness. That's that tension we want students to wrangle with as they digest things that are new to them, new ideas, new frameworks, new experiences. So I've been trying to then turn this into other curriculum opportunities from my experience. So I developed some reflective exercises around civic mindedness this past year that was based on the reflections that I was already writing for my students in these courses, like the capstone course. Last year, I was on sabbatical at Northeastern, where I helped run this AI for Impact co-op program, where teams of students were actually working with agencies from state government in Massachusetts and New Jersey, and I was mentoring them through their design phases and their client relationships as they tried to build AI tools to help solve some of their business problems. So I adapted and expanded those reflection prompts that I've been using in class for the co-op and allowed them to reflect on the strangeness of working in government and interrogating the humility that was required of them to work with non-technologists and other forms of experts in politics, policy, service delivery, et cetera. So that reflection was a space for them to do some of that, make some of those connections. And then I also adapted those same reflective exercises over the summer with a fellowship program in public interest technology that was run at Boston University. And with that, I also created a space at the end for the students to reflect together on what they were learning, how they had reflected on their experience, so that they could share across the different projects that they were doing, and how those questions of humility and care showed up as they were trying to build software and data solutions with those community partners. And I actually then shared this on the Keen Engineering Unleashed website. So if you want to check it out, it's card 4485, which has the curriculum there. And I'm continuing to update this year as I learn more from those pilot runs. As for the broader set of civic virtues that I'm trying to cultivate amongst my students, thanks to a grant from the Lilly Endowment and Wake Forest Educating Character Initiative, I'm co-leading a professional development experience for my fellow Olin faculty this year, exploring how we can cultivate these virtues among our engineering students. We're reading about the long history of virtue and character education and learning about those different types of approaches. Other than just, kind of developing good habits through practice and some reflection, we're trying to figure out what are all the ways that we can do this? What are the ways it's already showing up in our curriculum? How we can make this core to actually the ways that we try and cultivate our students into the type of civic professionals we want. And I hope to report on that at a future symposium. So to conclude, there really is no time like the present to work on this. We desperately need, I think, civic professionals with this techno-moral wisdom in order to build the systems that ensure we all flourish. So, thank you.